This is the Spedster Podcast, presented by N2Y, Shanny's Described in Caption Media Program, and Track Learning.
Well, hello and welcome to SPED Matters with Dr. Kurt Hulett and Dr. Mitch Yell. And SPED Matters is a podcast that really looks at and evaluates trending issues, litigation, and emerging trends within the field of special education. And essentially, Mitch and I are longtime special educators. We've been in many a capacity. We both began as special education teachers in the century preceding this one. So we've been there for a minute. And, you know, we both are very active in the field. Mitch is a professor at the University of South Carolina. He is a second level state review officer. So he reviews the due process hearing office decisions after they are decided and before they would go to litigation. He does a lot of professional development in the area of law and policy, super engaged at the national policy level. And he is one of, if not the leading scholars in special ed law and policy, certainly in the country, if not the world. And I am the CEO of Spedster, which is a website that brings all resources to special ed directors, teachers, and all special educators. And we work hard to curate and bring all that together for you so you don't have to search for it. And I also do a lot of PD. Our company does a lot of support of school districts and creating really good content. So on that topic, so today's SPED Matters episode, what we're going to focus on is leading due process hearing filings, litigation, and state complaints. And so, you know, Mitch, to me, one of the interesting things about special education law is that because it is so state-driven and state-specific, you know, it's pretty hard to find anything that aggregates all of this state activity and gives you all of the numbers or trending data. You pretty much have to go to each state, don't you, to really pull apart what's happening when it comes to state complaints and due process hearings?
Oh, yeah, that's exactly right, Kurt. Although the idea, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act although it's a federal law, all the states essentially have their own versions of the idea in law. Like they're titled by different names, but they have to provide at least the sorts of rights for students with disabilities as does the idea. They cannot provide less. They could provide more, but they have to, at baseline, meet the requirements of the idea.
So for example, New Jersey, I believe, requires short-term objectives. Now,
Yes.
up until I believe it was 04 in the reauthorization, short-term objectives were required to break down the annual goals and provide those benchmarks. In the 04 reauthorization, I believe we removed that requirement, but then New Jersey still requires it. So would that be an example of doing the minimum, which is the annual goal, but then making another level of requirement?
That is an excellent point. So the minimum is you have to have measurable annual goals. States could choose, and many do, to have short-term objectives, like New Jersey. Now, in South Carolina, we have chosen as a state not to require short-term objectives, except as the idea requires for students taking an alternate assessment. So, you know, that very much differs by state. Another area that can differ somewhat is in a state department may require more than of their school districts. For instance, in South Carolina, we have a very specific format for writing measurable annual goals. The idea does not, but we as a state do.
Which to me is the design of IDA that we don't always execute perfectly at the state level, which is, you know, the federal government gives the broad sweeping guidelines, and then each state gives that specificity. And, in my experience, there's a number of issues or a number of areas where we don't give enough specificity. Although a lot of people, libertarians, would argue that, we don't need so much specificity, but that's probably a different conversation for a different day on governance. But so what are you seeing as a, state review officer in South Carolina? And as you travel the globe, providing training and tracking policy and law, what are the big buckets that folks are dealing with today in special ed?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, Kurt. I see primarily three real buckets. And I think these really are kind of dimensions of the idea's requirement that schools are obligated to deliver a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, to all students with disabilities. Kind of the first bucket is the procedural bucket. And what that essentially means is, as school districts, we have to make certain, and teachers, that we have to make certain we're following the procedures of the law. And the idea and corresponding state laws will be filled with procedures like who has to be on the IEP meeting, how much notice we have to give the IEPs, the parents before an IEP meeting, what elements or components have to be in an IEP. Those are kind of the procedural. Now that's sort of the minimal though. And the second bucket is really much more important, and even according to the Supreme Court in a case called Andrew F. v. Douglas County School District back in 2017, and that bucket is the substantive bucket, which the Supreme Court says to meet our obligation under FAPE, school districts have to offer an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress in light of their circumstances. And what that means essentially is it boils down to what is in the IEP. What is the content of the IEP? Did we do a thorough assessment? Is that included in the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance statements? Are the goals measurable? Are we actually measuring the goals and then making decisions based on those goals? So really that substantive part is the IEP substantially likely or reasonably likely to lead to student progress? That's the second big bucket. The third big bucket has to do with implementation. That is, the parents and the school districts have agreed upon this IEP. Now, is the school district implementing the IEP as agreed upon? And we're seeing more and more instances in courts and hearings where schools are not implementing as they should. And that means, are they providing the instructional services? Are they providing the accommodations they said they would provide? Are they providing the amount of services they said they'd provide? So those are the three big buckets: procedural, substantive, and implementation.
So tell me this, Mitch. When we look at those three buckets, I've always felt, that the first element that's super essential is that substantive piece, which tends to, somewhat eclipse the importance of procedural, although that's important. But of course, in the 04 reauthorization, Congress said if there isn't a substantive impact, then a procedural error doesn't really matter as far as denying FAPE. And then implementation, of course, is super important, whether or not we're actually doing what we signed and said we would do. But if you go into, let's say, either substantive, the quality of the IEP, or you go into implementation, which is a big challenging issue, tell me some of the topics or threads you see running through state complaints, hearings, when parents are bringing, and what I'm trying to figure out is when parents are bringing an issue, they have not been able to resolve it at the local level, the school level, the district level, and now they're moving up through the process. Can you tell me some of the areas that tend to pop up? Is it on annual goals that are not measurable? Is it transition that has not been implemented? Is it the implementation of accommodations and modifications? If you were to say there are a couple areas you see popping up, and quite frankly, attorneys or advocates having success applying pressure on the school districts, what are those areas?
Well, that's really important. And I wanted to stress what you just said. In 2004, Congress essentially said, yeah, their procedural compliance is very important, but unless a procedural error really violates the substantive or causes substantive harm, that may not be enough reason. Just the procedural error in itself may not be enough reason to determine a school district has not provided FAPE. But I would say, really, there are a couple big problems. One that I see has to do with inadequate present levels. I mean, really, the present levels statements in the IEP, that's really the baseline, in effect, the baseline for the rest of the IEP. And if that's not correct, your goals and services won't be correct. So that's a huge problem, not getting all of a student's needs in the IEP in the present level statements.
So if you
Yeah.
hit each individual one, if you don't mind pausing for a follow-up, before
Yeah.
going to the next one, because these are just gold. So let me ask you this, Mitch, and I totally get why it happens, but one trend I see happening almost every time I sit in an IEP is, we'll start going through the PLAF, and some are good, some are not. I find where the software companies are breaking it down into the PLAF for ELA, the PLAF for math, and they section it out. I find those are less quality than the full narrative when it's put together for whatever reason. But what I find is this: so they will know through some piece of data that a child has a deficit in, say, reading comprehension. And it may have been, identified on a Woodcock-Johnson comprehension element subtest 3 years ago. Well, they know the kid needs the goal, and so they might reference that, or reference a low grade, reference failing a state test, however they want to identify comprehension. But then what they will do is they will set a goal for that year, setting the proficiency level or the goal at, say, 70%, which I do have to say, please don't ever, people, write another goal of 70%. 71, 69, I don't care. Just don't do 70. Because what that implies is that your goal is passing. Well, we give report cards, we give grades. Our goal in special ed is not for a child to pass a course. It is to grow markedly while receiving SDI to truly make progress in their area of need and deficit. But at any rate, what I'm finding, Mitch, is that there is no baseline. And what they've done is they've taken a goal, set a goal, a proficiency level. So let's say they know a kid is not reading on grade level, and they think by the end of that grade, they could be answering 4 out of 5 questions on a grade level passage correctly, but they haven't given them a passage just prior to this IEP to determine whether they're at 0, 1, or 2. And so there's no true baseline, which to me would indicate, how can you determine if a goal is reasonably ambitious if you don't have a starting point prior to even starting that goal? And then if every goal is 70%, well, then it's clear to me that it's not being individualized. We're setting a random passing number that is not based on the starting point. So my question to you, Mitch, is this something you see, or do you even see it as a big issue? Because I can't get around never finding the baseline for those goals in the PLAF. And I also struggle with the idea that, the great majority of our educators don't know that they should get that baseline prior to even writing that goal.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think our present levels need to be written in ways that become a baseline. If they don't, as you say, how can we possibly set a goal and then measure progress to the goal if we don't know where we're starting? So I think that's a huge problem, because if it's not done properly in the present level statement, the rest of the IEP is eventually probably going to fall. It
Well,
just
and
be
the thing I
well,
the thing I always mention, Mitch, is they'll also have a lot of standard scores and a PLAF, which I'm fine with because we often have real quality data. But here's the thing, and I guess my I'd like your response to this, Mitch, is when I read a PLAF and it has Woodcock Johnson, Wexler, Basque 3, all these scores, good scores, meaningful scores. We've got fluid reasoning, executive functioning. We know their percentile ranks. What I find is, one, we can't progress monitor those standard scores. We can't
no.
progress monitor those assessments. So one, they cannot be a baseline. But when I ask educators, well, where's your baseline? They will point to those standard scores, to which I say, well, that certainly identifies a deficit and that's a very good score, but that is not a baseline of a goal because you can't progress monitor it. And the other thing I find is when I then go to the annual goals and try and understand what the intent of the goal was, what I see 99% of the time under evaluation method, it'll say data collection. Well,
Yeah.
data collection is clearly not an evaluation method. And, when I train teachers, I always tell them, write it in a way that, one, if you're writing a PLAF, any educator, mom or dad, would know out of 30 IEPs, that was their kid. That's how specific it is. And then I also tell them with goals, somebody in another district who has had no conversations with anybody else, or a military member PCSing from Germany to Killeen, Texas, should be able to fully implement this IEP with no external knowledge. If you put as your form of evaluation and progress monitoring as data collection, it is impossible, unless they guess just right, how to implement that IEP. But what I'm finding, it's a culture, Mitch. I mean, there's no intent to create a form of monitoring progress. I was in an IEP this week, and when I asked to see the data and review it, essentially what I found was they had put all the grades in, and they said, well, we go and look for the grades that kind of match the area of deficit. And, I don't even know what to say to that because it's so far afield from the intention. But, what are you finding? Or is that just my unique experience?
No, I agree 100%. I mean, you were talking about tests like the Woodcock Johnson and about standard scores and things like that. And yeah, they can give us a good indication of where a child's skills are falling down, but really to examine those in ways that are appropriate to also progress monitor, you need to do things like curriculum-based measurement, where you're taking in reading, for instance, you're doing oral reading fluency measures. Now that's easy to collect data. It's very user-friendly, very time efficient, and it's very accurate. We know that in measuring a student's reading. You can't use like a standard score, as you said, to measure progress. So I'm a very big proponent in using curriculum-based measurement. I mean, there's tons of research on it. It's easy, it's quick, and it gives you accurate data you can do something about, where standard scores just do not.
Well, if I recall, Mitch, you trained under the godfather of progress monitoring, Stan Dino, right?
Yes, I did.
He
Yeah.
was kind of the truly one of the pioneers that really pushed that forward in special ed.
Yes, yeah, he did.
That's really
And
cool.
I obviously learned a lot about him, but also I think it is the perfect way to write not only educationally meaningful, but a legally correct IEP. If you have
Yep.
curriculum-based measurements, and it could be in reading, could be in math, writing, whatever, in your present level statement, you can write a goal based on that. and you can progress monitor. And it's very time efficient. And you can make decisions, and you have good data for making decisions.
Well, and one of the recommendations in training I always make is, because I'll get the questions, well, they have a learning disability or they're really struggling in reading. Well, you have phonics, phonemic awareness, vocabulary, all these elements of literacy. Where do we focus? And I always say, look, begin with, there are two goals of reading essentially at the end run of all of these subcomponents. One, the ultimate goal is to understand what you just read,
Yeah.
be able to communicate about what you just read. The other one is to read with some degree of fluency. And so I always tell them, look, for nearly every kid that has a disability, there's going to be a value to either oral reading fluency and reading comprehension. Now, you might have some additional areas you want to focus on, but I always tell them, gang, if you start there, now, if you have a great reader, so be it, maybe not oral reading fluency, but for my experience, those are two very valuable areas. But I will see, for instance, goals that have been copy and pasted from a state standards manual. And, it talks about inferencing and about 7 other areas. And of course, and I tell educators, gang, you just set yourself up that you now have to measure 7 discrete areas because you put it in the goal and you copied and pasted the standard. The other piece is, which piece of this goal actually aligns to the deficit you've identified in the PLAF? And then where have you identified how you're going to measure these 7 areas?
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess the big question I have, going back to, you said the PLAF, obviously, and maybe, we have you finish these elements, but my big question is, one, why don't we know how to do this? Because these do not seem like, these seem foundational to being a trained special educator. And they don't seem super complex. So a part of my question is why, and then what can we genuinely do to get folks back to, the spirit of IDEA? And of course, the idea being is that we identify their needs, we provide research-based intervention that's different than gen ed, we track it so we can respond to it, which is a whole nother issue. And we do this with fidelity, consistency, and of course, we accommodate and modify as needed. And I feel like we've gotten so far away from that. And I don't blame the special educators for any part of it, because I see how hard they're working, but I don't fully understand how we've gotten so far away from it.
Yeah. Now that is a perplexing question for sure. I think part of the reason maybe we don't understand or fully grasp the purpose of the measurable goals, and that is to measure and monitor progress. Now, maybe we use oral reading fluency for our reading goal, but that doesn't mean we can't also do comprehension activities in our services that we provide, literal comprehension, inferential. But remember, to go back, our measurable goal is to measure progress. And what we know is oral reading fluency is probably the best overall indicator of progress. It's what we call, what Standino called a general outcome measure. We're not interested in one goal on inferences and one goal on informational understanding and another goal on this and that. We're interested in measuring progress. So by putting oral reading fluency goals in, you have a measure, and then you can address these different areas in the services section.
Now, and a piece to that, Mitch, that I think we really need to focus on is also when I'm working with school districts and we're going through auditing, IEP records and trying to determine where we can work with them and grow and all of that. One of the big things I will ask for is the documentation. How are we measuring these goals? And when there's documentation, which quite often there's not, unfortunately, what I will be provided is a stack of daily sheets that has some type of a smiley face, frowny face, 3 or 4 part indicator, whether or not the child had a good or bad day. And, my first question is, okay, so with this, is this data put into a spreadsheet? Is it tracked? Is it graphed? And 99% of the time it's not. And so then I ask, what do you do with this? Well, we send it home. And this is our documentation for the goals. And, and I always ask, so what did you do with this data? What was the purpose and the intent? And they say, well,
Mhm.
documentation. and,
Mhm.
and I always say, this is not about compliance. This is not about checking a box. And we stopped to ask the question, why are we tracking data? And so, I'll ask them, okay, so Johnny has a goal in reading comprehension, and I see 6 daily sheets here where the child is flat or actually going down in a disparity of, assessments. But what I see is there's either a flat or a decreasing trend. Well, the idea of data is to intervene, to change your
Yeah.
approach, to make adjustments. And I would imagine if you go into due process and a parent can demonstrate that, yeah, they had a good IEP, but they never reacted to data or made any adjustments, even though the child wasn't progressing, that's going to be an issue. And so, to me, that comes back to just asking the question, why am I tracking data? And is it meaningful? Because if it's not, we don't want the teachers to waste their time. And again, if it's not, we need to ask, are we collecting the right data? And we need to put it into, say, graphing functions, or are we not collecting the right data? With behaviors, always ask, guys, we want to know potentially time, intensity, duration. Where is it occurring? What's happening before it occurs? Is it worse in the morning or better in the afternoon? Is the child on extended release medication? There's so many variables that we can capture, collect base data, and then have a real sense of what's working and what's not. But again, we feel so far removed. And my question to you is, so you mentioned the PLAF where everything starts, and not having appropriately written, I assume not having the baselines. So then what's the next piece relative to the trends you see and substantive violations? Where do you see the filings?
Well, I think one of the problems is as educators, teachers, oftentimes if we go back to our discussion of 3 buckets, the procedural, substantive, and the implementation, I think too often teachers and administrators think of data collection in the first bucket. It's just something we have to do to satisfy the law. It's the minimum we have to do. But in fact, that's really the most important part of our programming is the entire monitoring of the student's progress, because we cannot make changes based on that. And probably I would say certainly there are a number of problems. One very significant problem is I have examined hundreds and hundreds of IEPs over the last 10, 15 years. I can count on one hand that goals I read that were truly measurable, that were written in a way that you could actually measure them and then use that data. And I always tell folks, well, if you write a goal and you can't graph it, you don't have a measurable goal. So I think that's the second big piece is teachers don't seem to be able to write good measurable goals. And we were both teachers for many years, and it's not that teachers don't want to do it. It's that they're not prepared properly, I think, a lot of times to write actually good measurable goals.
And that's a series of podcasts, what we can do, because clearly, we have a couple areas. We have undergraduate training and licensure programs. We have graduate programs. We have PD and training within the school districts. Supposedly, we need a lot of work there. But, at some point, we really have to evaluate if this is the outcome of the money we're investing into training, preparation, certification. What is the outcome or the return on that investment? And based on what, if on one hand you can count out of hundreds of IEPs how many met kind of that substantive bare minimum, that's alarming, right? So,
Yeah.
one of the questions I have of you, Mitch, too, is one of my concerns isn't that some of these issues exist not only to the degree they do, that's concerning and alarming, but what's even more alarming is I don't hear this in professional circles. I don't
Yeah.
hear this being discussed. And the parents don't have the depth of knowledge most often to even evaluate an IEP, know if it's measurable, know if it's going to be done. They don't understand standard scores. Um, and so the only ones who really could sound the alarm would be the educators. And again, with all the conferences and sessions I sit in, I don't hear that. So do you have any thoughts on, are we just missing it? Are we not aware, or are we aware, but we feel powerless? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is a real conundrum, is why there's good information available on writing measurable goals, on collecting easy, user-friendly data that is actually meaningful. Why isn't it done more often? And I'm not certain, but one of the things I've seen as a professor who's been involved in teacher training for years is so often our candidates get out into the field with the best intentions, they know what to do, and somehow the system sort of discourages that. The system's all about that first bucket. Let's get the procedures right. And that kind of leads to a case I'm doing right now. One of the things I'm seeing is teachers aren't doing progress reports to parents, and when they don't do them, and when they do them, they don't make any sense because they'll say teacher observation, uh, or
P
have a,
address
a smiley face or two, and not real data. And they're not making decisions based on data.
and copy and paste the same
Yeah.
response. And here's the thing, Mitch, that from a self-preservation standpoint, when I train folks, I just make recommendations such as do not go into your local software and, click on every goal that has language like in 8 out of 10 trials over a period of 3 weeks. Because one, is it reasonable every progress monitoring period you're going to do 10 trials, 10 assessments, and then you're going to track that over a 3 week period? And if you don't get that 3 week at 80% on 10 trials, what are you going to do? What is
Yeah.
to happen, because that's what indicates it. And then now they're on the hook to demonstrate that they have given 10 of those trials, and that they made it on those 8. So my thing is always be simple, be straightforward, have that one very specific criteria that you're measuring, do it and make it meaningful. But where the goals sound great, they sound flowery, but in implementation, or even when it comes to documentation, we're not there.
No, no. And I think a lot of the problem has to do with, I think, almost administrative a misunderstanding of what involvement and progress in the general ed curriculum means. And I think so many administrators that said have concluded that, whoa, that means we have to put the standards in our IEPs. Well, that's absolutely not correct, because the standards, what if a child can't even begin to access those standards? You've got to go back and you've got to teach them. But I think that's a lot of the problem, is this just general confusion. And another problem has to do with these proliferation of goal banks, where
Oh,
you get a computer program that has hundreds of goals. It's like a cookbook of goals, and you have IEP teams going, well, that looks good, and that one looks good, and that one looks good, and just picking out a number of goals that may or may not be appropriate given the individual needs of the child.
yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting, you talk about the proliferation of products and companies, and and that's what I see is in some cases they're driving bad practice and have driven bad practice. But on the other side of it, one of the solutions I see involves companies and these resources, because one of the big issues I see is a teacher will have a goal. And, again, it'll say that teacher observation and data collection, which again means we have no clue. And we don't have a resource identified. We don't have data capture sheets identified. And I've always felt if they had the resources as well as the guidance, and so if they write a goal, and whether it's a special ed director, whomever it is, helps that individual say, okay, so here are your options for measuring this. We recommend one of these three approaches. You have a CBM, you have, a teacher-made quiz or test, but this is how you need to create that. This is the number of items I recommend. Give them examples of data collection sheets, give them examples of SDI. And I think if they had real ready access to how to implement each of those steps at their fingertips, and they knew what the district wanted to see, I think we'd make a lot of progress. But so often, when I'm asking questions and training teachers and I say, well, how often do you collect progress? Well, it depends. And I said, well, in general, once or twice a marking period. And I say, well, what has the district conveyed to you? What is best practice? Well, I don't know. So if we're not even giving guidance, and again, we don't have a definitive answer, but I always recommend one data point per week per goal. If you can get one data point, it shouldn't overtax the teacher, which is a consideration, but it also should provide some meaningful data. If I have 9 data points over a 9-week period, I can track and see trends. I can see what's going up, what's going down, because what you have to ask is it meaningful? If I get 1 or 2 data points on a goal per week, the grading book is more valuable than the actual goals, because you don't have enough data to make any decisions on the child. So, what are your thoughts on whether it's providing concrete examples, resources, and almost walking it out? So one example, let's say a special ed director was to say, okay, guys, I'm going to give you an example of every major type of deficit and goal area we tend to come across. So, reading comprehension is big in a number of areas. Here are 3 goals for comprehension. Here are 3 ways of determining baselines. Here are 3 instruments to progress monitor. Now, you don't have to use these, but these are 3 examples of the expectation we have of, it being equivalent, having some standardization, some reliability, that it's measuring at the same level each time. It can be implemented with fidelity. And again, you can still give, I think, creativity, but they need to meet the criteria of the other 3 at least. But what are your thoughts on special ed directors kind of stepping more in that direction and being a little bit more prescriptive and providing a little bit more guidance?
Yeah, I think that would be a real boon. It would really help. I think largely the problem is inappropriate training and preparation, that we're just not preparing teachers. It is so simple to do good baseline gathering and data gathering if you're doing it correctly. And I think that's the problem, is oftentimes we're not preparing teachers to do it correctly. And then they're getting messages like you've got to do the state standards and that sort of thing. That just doesn't make any sense. And I always think of progress monitoring as, what if you go to your doctor and your knee is bothering you, your shoulder's bothering you? What's the nurse going to take you in? What's the first thing they're going to do? They're going to weigh you. They're going to check your blood pressure. They're going to check your temperature, because those are measures of physical health. And the doctor has a baseline. They know what your blood pressure should be, what an ideal weight is, what the temperature should be. And even though that may have nothing to do with why you're going into the doctor, he's using that baseline. He or she is using that baseline data as a measure of your physical health. What we need is measures of educational health. And we have that in curriculum-based measures and many of the easy to do measures that teachers just don't really know about or know how to do them.
Yeah, and I always felt, the training models are so off in the schools. And again, it's not their fault. And I work with educators all the time, and I'll tell you what I can't reconcile, Mitch, is these are some of the most wonderful human beings. They love children. They work their backs off, and they want to do the right thing, but yet we can't connect what we know to be best practice and legally compliant practices that also marries with their effort and intentions. And so figuring out that connection to me has just been really hard. But then we have so many other challenges. And so when we think of training, well, we do as much as we can during teacher work week. And of course, we know we don't even need research to tell us, one training one time a year for a couple hours does not result in, lifelong learning, growth, improvement. And so we have a broken model of PD. And I always thought, whether it's ongoing, micro, short term, consistent, and more of a coaching model. I think about, on our local teams here every Friday, we've got, 20 coaches on a sideline, but we've got one ABA specialist for the local school district. And what do? They coach every day. They hit the important pieces. They go over data. They track trends. They track how many times the team runs off tackle, how many times they pass. And they're analyzing, the data to great degrees. But again, we seem to be putting more resources into that than we are supporting these teachers and educators who need all of these resources. So, as you're talking about the PLAF, the goals, the services, and what I'm hearing is a lack of internal consistency, the elements aren't connecting, and they're just not high quality, that again goes to training, support. And again, I'm at kind of a loss for what we do. But the other piece, and the reason it concerns me, Mitch, that I don't hear this dialogue is we can't fix what we don't acknowledge is an issue. If we're not even talking about this issue, how do we ever fix it? If we have a reauthorization coming up, how do we talk about meaningful changes to reauthorization or to the law if we're not even talking about a given issue?
Right. Yeah.
And
Well,
so, yeah.
Well, one of the things I always think of is, in fact, I was doing a state review of a hearing. This was a couple months ago, and one of the attorney for the school district, a teacher was rightly talking about best practices, and the attorney interrupted her and said, "But the law doesn't require best practices, does it?" You could say, yeah, well, maybe the law doesn't require the best practices, but here's what the big deal is. If you do the best practices, you're going to have a IEP that's not only legally correct, but is educationally meaningful. And it's those best practices that we need to communicate to our field. And we need to do so in a regular way. I mean, the knowledge base is growing so quickly in special education. I mean, right now, I have friends that are developing curriculum-based measures for high school students in algebra. I mean, it's all there and it's all available. And almost all, it's all free for many times. But
Well, it's interesting as you mentioned that, it kind of triggers me to think of some of the sponsors of this very podcast. DCMP is a group out of your home state, South Carolina, and they provide, it's extraordinary free content. If you're a parent, if you're a school district, if you're a teacher with one child with a disability, or you're a parent with one child with a disability, it's 100% free. This group has been doing this for 30 years on 5-year cycles with the US DOE, totally government funded, some of the highest quality content I've ever seen. It's the type of stuff you pay gazillions of dollars for from
Yeah.
companies. And again, it is totally free and accessible. And so we don't have to pay a lot. But DCMP does an amazing job. We've got groups like Channy's, which is a really neat group that sponsors us in this podcast. And this is a mom of a kiddo with autism who kid was struggling with dysgraphia, handwriting, and then like in math, getting everything lined up correctly. And so she created this entire approach and process, and basically SDI for handwriting and math. So there are tools out there. To me, it's getting them in the right hands at the right time, and helping them understand how to implement it. But again, I do think one of our first things is talking about it. Also, in summary, what I'm hearing from you is what's leading the way, interestingly, is exactly what I guess the law says, as you reference the '04 reauthorization, where it states, procedural error doesn't really matter so much if there's not a substantive impact. So, and for those who might say, well, what does that mean? Tell me what you think, Mitch. But, to me, a good example would be, let's say in the state you have 45 days to evaluate a child that's suspected of having a disability. Instead of getting it done in 45 days, you get it done in 48 days. So procedurally, you went beyond the timeline, but what was the impact on the kid? And
That's a very good example.
I think, to me, what I like about that change is, when you and I were writing IEPs in '80s and '90s, essentially we were always worried about dotting the I's, crossing the T's, because we didn't want a tiny error to be found or indicated. And they did away with that type of stuff. But what's interesting to me, Mitch, is I hear you saying what's trending in state complaints due process is this substantive quality-based piece of the IEP that was identified and kind of fleshed out in the Andrew F. case. And so, it takes me back to, and, correct me if I'm wrong, but, as a hearing officer, when they review it, they're going to apply the Rowley-Andrew two-part test, with the first part being, does it meet the procedures, first of all, under the Rowley? And then you have, is it a quality IEP, essentially, which would then be the substantive or the Andrew piece of it. And of course, if you don't have quality elements, you can't say yes to both, and therefore you don't pass that two-part test.
Yeah.
So I hear you talking about quality, but yet when I work with districts, what I find is the proficiency, the focus, the time, and the resources are put into procedural elements, such as sending out the notice, scheduling, administrative tasks that are very important, but as Congress has said, not as important as the quality of the document. Yet we spend very little resources on the training, supports, resources for those special educators. So there seems to be a disconnect there, Mitch, between the law, litigation, due process, what's trending, and where we're putting our resources, time, and energy as special educators. Would you agree or no?
I absolutely agree. One of my favorite quotations from the Supreme Court in the Andrew F. case was, the IEP must aim to enable the child to make progress. After all, the central function of an IEP is to set out a plan for pursuing academic and functional advancement. And I remember back when I was a teacher, and you have that 1 week before the kids get there, and you have all the special educators go for a day and with a special ed director. It was virtually always about the procedural bucket. and not enough about the substantive bucket. And that's where we need to put our, put our eggs in that bucket, because that's where we can make a real difference in the lives of the kiddos we work with, plus making certain that our IEPs are legally correct.
So a couple quick takeaways as we get to the end of our the hour here. What I'm hearing from you, Mitch, is again, what's trending is complaints are coming forward and also winning where it has to do with the quality of the IEP and of course the preponderance and responsibilities on the parent to bring evidence of that. But again, it's on quality. We need to spend our time focusing on quality. We need to reevaluate our training. We need to look at the supports we're providing these folks. And we need to set high expectations within special education